that tune sound familiar to you? It's a tune that's played all across the nation and around the world. But it's the message of the tune I tend to cherish a whole lot. It's a message of grace. Amazing grace. The song Amazing Grace was written by John Newton, an 18th century English African slave trader. Most of his years were spent in one of the darkest periods of human suffering, the West African slave trade. There, slaves, well, Africans, were captured and crammed on large ships where they were taken from West Africa across the Atlantic Ocean into the Caribbean and North America. Who would ever think that such a life would be responsible for such a beautiful song that we sing today? But later on in John Newton's life, he found and learned about a grace that was rooted deep in his Christian faith. After which, he renounced his activities in the slave trade and dedicated his life against what he had spent most of his life living. Grace is also a very important element in the Christian faith. It is expressed in the character of God and his relationship to people. The Bible describes God as holy. He doesn't do anything wrong, and he doesn't like sin, which is disobedience to his word. He is also described as someone who's just and fair. While on the other hand, people are described as individuals who are prone to sin or disobey God either by their thoughts, words, or actions. And in light of a holy God, people's sins stand out like ketchup on a bright white shirt. And because he's holy, he can't tolerate sin even though he longs to get into a relationship with people. And yet because he's just, he's bounded by the law to punish lawbreakers. After all, the law was designed to punish those that break the law and not those that keep the law. But because he's also a loving God and rich in grace, he sent his son Jesus Christ into the world with the main objective to pay for the sentence that all people's sins have created. And so Jesus, he came into the world, and his life reflected one that not only showed what God was like, but he never disobeyed God. And there he stood on the cross, stretched out hands, dying a cruel death. And that's an invitation of grace that I've accepted in my life. But the idea of grace is not about letting someone get away with the wrong that they've done. It's more about a person being aware of that they've done something wrong, and they're facing the weight of the consequences of their actions. And the very person who has all the authority to carry out that corrective action instead offers them a gift of forgiveness bundled with a gift of love. Another incident of grace that happened in my life happened a couple of years ago when my roommate had just purchased a brand new Acura. She was a little bit hesitant about letting me drive her car, but the opportunity came when she did consent me to drive her car. She had to leave the state, and she allowed me to take her to the airport and allowed me to use her car while she was away. Well, one day I was kind of pulling up into a parking lot, and I heard metal crunch. I got out of the car, and my heart sank when I saw this huge scratch on the side of her car. I could not muster up the confidence to even tell her what happened. When I picked her up at the airport, she didn't even seem to notice the scratch. She just quickly jumped in and just blabbered about her trip. But long before then, I started to burst in tears and just cry uncontrollably and told her, "I scratched your car! Oh my God, I didn't mean to do it!" And I went on and on crying, and she got out of the car and looked at the scratch, and then looked at me, and then looked at the scratch, and then she was like, "Ruth, don't cry. These things happen. That's okay. Come, we'll deal with it afterwards. You need to go back to work, and you need to stop crying." That's grace. Amazing grace. The sort of grace that caused John Newton to pen the words to that song. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity of listening to a young lady share just a tragic moment in her life. She began to speak of how she got pregnant between the ages of 12 and 15, and then 1 year later, she lost her daughter, her aunt, and her sister in a car accident. Shortly after that period, she witnessed her mom commit murder and stood in that horrific position where her mother accused her of that crime that she did not even commit. In her own words, she said she was broken and hurt, and she was sent to prison. Shortly after she was released, this young lady, who had every right to be bitter against her mom, to show vengeance against her mom, instead returned home and took care of her mom. She washed her dishes, cleaned her home, even called her periodically to see how she was doing. Her mom was confused. She couldn't believe that this is the very daughter she falsely accused, and now she's being nice to her. But her daughter looked to her with the understanding that she had been forgiven much. And because of that, she could forgive her mom and show love to her as well. That's grace. Amazing grace. How different would our lives be if it was filled with grace? How different would it be if you looked into the eyes of your friends, co-workers, neighbors, when they have done wrong and they're looking at you, expecting you to go crazy, to act berserk, and instead you hug them and honestly tell them, no, I'm not happy about what you did, but we can work this out. I choose to forgive you. That's grace. Amazing grace. How different would your life and my life be if someone who has every right to be mad at us, to even sue us, instead show us grace? Wouldn't that be amazing? Mr. Toastmaster.